just been like hugely beneficial. I think the entire, mostly on the engineering side of things, they just feel better prepared to sort of like deal with these things. I think before it was sort of like a free for all of people just kind of, throwing questions into Slack and hoping that someone would answer them and where are we and things like that. And it's really just like a very clean and very sure process now. I am a CX lead on the customer side of things. So I head up specifically. I head up our support team, and also sort of I'm a pretty strong liaison between the customer-facing teams and the product teams. So things like incident response, for example, typically fall into my wheelhouse as we try to sort of like bring these two groups of people together into one cohesive machine.
Perfect. And for those who aren't familiar with Clay, can you give us a quick view of kind of the team size and what you all do and whether you're, remote or in-person type of environment?
Yeah, for sure. So, Clay, we're about 50 people now. We just recently raised our seed about a month ago, and we're mostly in person in New York City. I'm obviously working from home today. We have a relatively relaxed policy, but everyone really likes being in the office, and so I actually live in Connecticut, and I find myself commuting about an hour and a half most days just to be in the office, just because it's always a good time.
Perfect. But you have that flexibility. So definitely needing something that supports both remote and in-person collaboration. That makes sense.
Totally.
So I'd love to hear a bit. Now, you all have recently adopted Rootly, somewhat recently, anyways. You're fairly early on into the journey. So I'd love to just hear a bit about kind of that before world. Was there a specific moment that you recall feeling a need for tooling, or what were those challenges that led you down the path of looking for a tool like us?
Yeah, it was actually kind of a little bit of a funny pathway. So I actually I used Rootly at a previous company. I wasn't by any means in charge of it, but I was in a similar role, and so using it pretty frequently to sort of manage incidences. And when I came to Clay, you guys actually reached out and said like, "Hey, it looks like you've changed jobs. Are you interested?" And at that point, I talked to our engineers, and we were sort of like, "Nah, I don't think we really need anything right now. We're doing fine with our like, Slack thread system that was literally just a Slack thread." And so we were. That was back in like March or April, so not even that long ago. And then more recently, in the past couple of months, we've had a couple of incidences where one particularly where like our app went down for whatever reason, and I think there were 4 different Slack threads happening at the same time in 4 different channels throughout our Slack. And that was the moment where I was like, oh my God, we need something to actually like organize this, because it was really, there was information being lost. There was, people's time being wasted because they had to sort of jump between different threads, and people were missing updates. And that was sort of the thing that I knew Rootly had solved for based on my experience beforehand. And so I pretty quickly was like, okay, it's time, and kind of took the reins on getting this rolled out in the past couple of weeks.
It's funny how fast that sort of thing can happen. Like our Slack bot works until it doesn't, and then it's like, oh my gosh, what
Yeah,
is going on?
exactly.
Were there like specific features or integrations? I know you had used Rootly before. Were there specific things you were looking for to solve for? Or were you looking more just for like a kind of all-encompassing tool?
The biggest thing was really just like centralized communication, which I know is like the sort of foundation of Rootly, is sort of opening up that Slack thread. But there were a couple of other sort of like ancillary pieces that I think started to become pretty intense pretty quickly. First was like our status page updates. So we had a status page that we were running that it was very unclear whose role it was to actually update it, when it was being updated, how we were updating it. And it was sort of like, if it got updated, that was sort of great. And if it didn't, and it was sort of like, it wasn't, it just kind of fell through the cracks often. And so there was a status page. There was also one thing that I think that I didn't really experience in my previous role, but experienced pretty heavily here, was the sort of influx of customer tickets that came through the support queue when an incident was happening. And so what ended up happening is my team would sort of get this messaging, and they would copy and paste it to each and every single conversation that happened. And one of the things that I ended up building with the help of Rootly was sort of a custom integration with Intercom, which is what we use for support, that when an incident is kicked off, it also kicks off like Intercom's concept of like a ticket. And what that allows is this sort of like one-to-many communication through all of the customers kind of reaching out to us. And all of that is sort of triggered based off of the incident. We can post updates there. all of that sort of happens in a very cohesive way right now, that I think was a huge time suck when we were sort of going through it, and is a pretty big win for us.
Yeah, I love seeing those use cases outside of engineering and specifically fixing the incident. That's part of why I was hoping to talk to you all as we start thinking about, specifically how Rootly helps startups, because we have such a breadth of customers and we spend a lot of time, of course, talking about our enterprise customers and those big logos. But what I find is in the startup space, there's really interesting use cases. And I think startups have this like natural push to just do things differently. So you're not coming in with all of these kind of old guard ideas of how incident response should work. And we see these really interesting setups like a custom intercom automation to keep customers informed, which is just really cool to see different ways that people use the tool.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it's sort of like it pushed us to sort of redefine what we decide is an incident. I think historically, even in my old place, it was very clearly like if the app is down, it's an incident, or if like a really big part of the app is down, it's an incident. But we've actually sort of here, because of the capabilities that Rootly gave us, we've expanded that to be like anytime we need one-to-many customer communication, we're actually going to kick off an incident for that, just because it's an easier way to sort of deal with that. So a really good example for Clay is like we integrate with like 75 plus different providers, and previously, if one of those providers went down, we would, let the engineers know. There's not really much they can do in most cases. We just have to wait for the provider to sort of ramp back up. Now, because we're getting so many customers sort of reaching out to us saying like, hey, I can't use X, Y, and Z, we now have a really clean way to sort of do that one-to-many communication, even if it's not what you would consider sort of like a traditional incident. And I think that's a really just like kind of interesting sort of defining thing that happened actually throughout our implementation, as I sort of was like, maybe we could actually use this for a little bit broader of a scope than what we typically consider an incident.
Yeah, and that's the type of thing we love to hear, like a world where it's actually easier and more efficient to declare an incident than to try to minimize something or like to avoid that whole process because it's like, oh, it adds so much complexity and it's too much for the situation. That's exactly what we want to see. And when you were all looking at bringing in a tool, I know, like you said, you had experience with Rootly, but did you consider any other tools or platforms, or was it a pretty obvious for you from the get-go?
Yeah, I think just based on my previous, experience, it was kind of a no-brainer. I think that there were different pieces of it that I was actually surprised that we could sort of like roll into. So I think when I was at my last place, we used PagerDuty alongside Rootly, and I know that you all sort of like have built out this on-call system, and so we were able to sort of consolidate there. Same thing with the status page. I think we sort of used it at our last place, but it was nice to be able to sort of like we were looking at a couple of different things just for a status page, and being able to sort of consolidate things into one system, I think was really helpful. The only other sort of thing that we considered was just building it out by ourselves. We do that with a lot of products, is that we sort of, look at a product and we say, hey, we could probably build out a half version of this that's good enough. And we, could go with that. And I think I played with it in Zapier for like, 20 minutes and was like, you know what, maybe this is not worth it. And we should actually get a system that does this for real.
And I know that you all, you want to move fast, you're early stage. Can you talk a bit about like the experience of actually going from bring this tool in to being able to run an incident with it? Because we were just talking recently, have started fully running incidents in the tool. What was that ramp up and onboarding process like for you?
It was relatively quick. I think that one of the things that was surprising to me was how much support we had from the Rootly side. So even from before we signed, working with your team to sort of like build the case that we need this, I think it was a relatively easy case to build because like we were having incidences that were not going well. And I think that, there was a lot of sort of like hunger, especially from the engineering side of things, to sort of organize this process. And so I think that, from there right up until when we signed and sort of had everything sort of ready to build out, you all were reviewing like the doc that I had put together that sort of laid out the whole incident response, and we're giving feedback on that. There were calls in between to sort of make sure that everything was sort of moving together. And then even the offer, we didn't take you up on this, but I feel like we probably should have, but the offer to sort of like jump on with our entire team to do a training and demo and things like that. So I think that was, it seems like something that I was kind of surprised by. And even little things, just like, entering the Slack channel and seeing like your CEO and co-founder kind of jumping in there and sort of saying hi and, making sure that everything was okay. It was really nice to just feel like we were supported by a whole team, throughout the entire process that we had.
So I guess the last thing I'd love to just talk about and hear more about is overall kind of before versus after. How have you noticed your incident response process change, hopefully for the better, since started adopting the tool?
Yeah, it's a good question. So since we sort of like rolled it out, I think it was early last week or the week before, we've had a couple of incidences that we were able, nothing major, thank goodness. So that's very exciting. But it's sort of like this weird thing. I was talking with someone on your team about how like we were ready to roll it out, and we were sort of like hoping for an incident to sort of like see if it worked, but like not really. But yeah, we've had a couple of them. Some of them lower severity, again, sort of when an integration goes out or something along those lines. And it's just been like hugely beneficial. I think the entire, mostly on the engineering side of things, they just feel better prepared to sort of like deal with these things. I think before it was sort of like a free for all of people just kind of, throwing questions into Slack and hoping that someone would answer them and where are we and things like that. And it's really just like a very clean and very sure process now of like, when there's an incident, this is how you're notified, this is who's involved, this is the severity, this is what's going on, and everything sort of happens in one place. And this is when status pages should be updated, this is the language we're using. Like all of that is just sort of like built into this process now. And it's just been like hugely helpful and such a big upgrade from where we were just a month ago when it was just sort of a free for all. So we're pretty thrilled. We're again sort of like anxiously waiting for the big one to happen and seeing if everything holds up. But we feel pretty confident that as we work out the tweaks and kind of get things going, that we're much better prepared to deal with things than we were previously.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. And if and when I would actually knock on wood, but my dog will bark. But even when that happens, I'm confident you guys will nail it. But you know where to find us if you do need any help with that. But that's really, really great to hear. And I think it sends such a good signal, to your team early on too, that you're investing in tooling to make this thing that is hard and scary feel a lot easier and a lot safer for people. So I think, obviously for us, we always hope that Rootly is the tool people choose to do that. But I think any amount of tooling and support that people are giving people, especially early on, to go into these situations and not feel terrified and like they're going to get fired or they don't know what they're doing, I think is so, so helpful. So I'm really glad that Clay went with Rootly, of course, but just that you guys are paying that close attention to the quality of life of responders too, and your customers. I think it's really clear in how you talk about this that, your customers and your employees are really at the forefront of why you've chosen to invest in something like this, which is always really, really nice to see, especially for companies at an early stage. So thank you so much, George, for chatting with me today. I'm so happy to hear that you guys are getting on well so far and looking forward to watching what you do and how you scale and grow with the tool.
Yeah, really appreciate the chance to jump on. It's been great working with you and your team, and yeah, we're excited for where things go from here.